Hello everyone and welcome to this Axiom tutorial. Today we are going to go through everything you need to know about Axiom, from the most basic things such as how to install the mod or how to move around in the different building modes, to the most advanced techniques that I've learned in the past years of using the mod. I will explain everything with as much detail as I can, and towards the end we will work with 3 examples on how to do terrains, structures and organics. This will be a long video, however there are timestamps and indications so you can skip and jump to the segments that you need. Without further ado, let's begin with this. For a start, Axiom is a mod for the Java edition of Minecraft, so if you play on Bedrock, this sadly won't work for you. If you are playing on Java, the first thing you need to do is to download the mod. For that, you can go to the official Axiom site, into the download section, or to a site like Modrinth, where you can find many mods for Minecraft. All the links are down below in the description. I will use Modrinth for this example. When you go into Modrinth, you just need to search for Axiom here. And the first one that appears saying by Mulberry is the one that you want to click on. Here you can scroll down and find a bunch of information. And you can actually find the tutorial on how to install it down at the bottom, but let's go through it quickly here as well, just in case. If you head back to the top, you can click on versions right here. This will open up a list with all the versions of the mod. In general, the first one is the most updated one. While I'm recording this, it's for Minecraft 1.21.4. It might be different for you, but the process should be the same. All you need to do here is click on the arrow to the right where it says download, and that should automatically begin downloading the mod for you. For now, just save the file somewhere where you can remember in your system. We will use it later on. Now, if you notice here, it says fabric. That's because Axiom requires a mod loader to run in Minecraft, so now we have to install that. We are going to head over to Google and type fabric loader, and that should send us to the fabric page. Or you can go to the link directly. Here we will click on download at the top and then download for Windows. If you don't have Windows and have another operating system, you might need to download the universal share instead right there underneath. If not, just click download for Windows and that will begin downloading the fabric installer. This is an executable file, .exe. So once it's downloaded, just click on it to open and begin the installation process. Here you can choose the Minecraft version, make sure it's the same for which you downloaded Axiom for, and the location where you have your Minecraft installed. Make sure that Create Profile is on and hit Install. It shouldn't take long, click on Accept and then you can close that. So now if you open the Minecraft launcher, make sure you are on Java edition, you should see that the version here says Fabric Loader. Before clicking on play, we will go to the top and click on installations. Find the fabric loader version we just created and click on the folder. Here you need to find the mods folder. And right there is where we need to place the Axiom mod we downloaded at the beginning. So copy that and bring it here. However, it won't work only with this. We first need another mod called Fabric API. This is pretty simple. Go back to the Modrinth page where we downloaded Axiom before, and on the search bar write Fabric API. The first option should be fine. Again, go to versions and download the corresponding version to the ones we previously downloaded. This one we want to copy it and paste it in the same folder where we placed the Axiom file. It should end up looking like this. So now we are done. If we click play, our game should start and the Axiom mod should be working properly. A few ways to quickly verify that is to check here below. It should say modded between brackets. And that's it for the installation process. The first thing you'll notice with Axiom is this extra slot all the way to the right. That will open up a set of 7 tools that we can use to perform basic edits to our build, like moving, copying, rotating and so on. Then we also have this menu, called the context menu, where we can find many quality of life perks to make creative building easier for us, like modifying the flying speed, having extra creative hotbars and replacing blocks quickly. And finally we have the big and scary editor menu, which will allow us to perform the more complex operations on a larger scale. It's a lot of information and it can be a bit overwhelming if it's your first time seeing this, but don't worry, we will go breaking it down step by step for everyone to understand. With many tools and functions, keybinds are key for using Axiom and following this tutorial. So let me show you how to configure some settings and avoid any possible issues. If you press Escape and go to Options, Controls, Keybinds, and then scroll down, you will find the Axiom section, where you can configure three important things. First, the Builder tool slot. That's the keybind to quickly jump to the arrows. By default it's 0, so if we press that, it automatically goes there. Then we have Left Alt to open the context menu. That is this menu. You can keybind that to anything you prefer. And lastly, the Toggle Editor UI, which will be the one to open the big menu, by default using Right Shift. Then if we scroll even further down, we will find the Axiom Capabilities section. And what's that? If we go back and open the context menu with Left Alt or any keybind you chose, we will find the Axiom Capabilities here to the left. You can click on them to toggle them on and off, or you can keybind them to quickly switch them on and off. These things change some aspects of the gameplay to make it easier for us to build. If we hover over them, it will tell us what each of them do. From top to bottom we have No Clip. While this is on, it will allow you to go through blocks while flying, like if you were in spectator mode. This is one of the most useful ones and I highly recommend keybinding this one. For example, I have it set to the letter U. Then we have Angel Placement. With this one on, we can basically place blocks mid-air. Then Fast Place will allow you to hold down the right click and place blocks very quickly. Infinite Reach will allow you to place blocks at larger distances than normal. Tinker is an interesting one. This is basically an integrated debug stick. What it allows you to do is to right-click blocks with an empty hand to modify its properties. To give you some examples, you can right-click grass to turn it into path blocks, or a fence to bring out its sides. Notice how it does something different depending on the face of the block we click, so bear that in mind. I recommend having this one on mostly all the time. Then we have No Updates, which will prevent existing blocks from updating. For instance, you can have floating sand and it won't fall even if you place blocks around them, or a wall and it won't connect to adjacent blocks. If we turn it off and place the blocks next to the sand, it will now update and fall. Next, we have Force Place. This one will allow you to place blocks in places where normally you wouldn't be able to. For instance, grass on top of stone. To use this one properly, you will need to have the No Updates one on too. Otherwise, these illegal blocks will break the instant you modify something around them. Right below is my favorite one, Replace Mode. With this on, if we grab any block, we can see that we get a transparent block layout. So if we right click, it will replace the grass block with our block. This is a replacement to the classic double click to break down and place instantly, with the advantage that it's so much easier and faster. The only thing to consider is that you can't place new blocks while this is on, so I recommend you have this one keybinded to something, in my case to the letter Y, to quickly switch back and forth. And lastly, we have Bulldozer. This is the opposite of Fast Place, basically hold down left click to break blocks fast. Those are all the capabilities. The only way to really learn them is to play around with them until you find the ones that fit your own building style. On the same context menu, we can see that there are more things. First, we have a bunch of hotbars. This is useful to save different block palettes or blocks that you may use often, so you can scroll up and down to select another hotbar quickly and use those blocks. You also have multiple pages of this, so you can really store as many hotbars as you need. Then here you can change to any of the other game modes, Survival, Spectator and Adventure. To quickly go back to Creative, press Left Alt. That will open the menu again and put you back in Creative automatically. Ignore the two options at the top for the time being. To the right we have the speed slider. This will allow you to increase or decrease your flying speed to adjust your needs. Destroy items, which, well, it's like a trash can to clean your hotbars. And finally, this small toolbox over here. the toolbox will open up more settings. Down here we can configure the reach limit of the infinite reach capability. Let's say you want to have a larger reach than normal but don't want it to be infinite. Then you can change that there. Key presses is what I use to display the keys that I'm using to open each menu, which you can see on the right side of the screen. Liquid opacity can make the water look transparent, which is useful for those underwater builds. Minimum brightness overrides the default brightness of the game. Setting that to 100% is like having night vision on all the time. Then we get to type replace. This small hidden thing is super useful and it goes hand by hand with the replace mode we saw before. Basically, if we have replace mode on and we set type replace to on as well, it will allow us to replace blocks by their type. For instance, let's say we have mangrove stairs, mangrove slabs, a birch door and a pale oak fence, and we want to change them all to the best wood type in the game, spruce. In a normal scenario we would need to grab all the different types of spruce blocks to do this, but with those settings on we just need to grab the spruce plank and right click on top of them. You can see that it will automatically select the spruce block type that matches with what we had. Of course, that works as long as the type of block exists. It won't work with calcite, for instance. My recommendation here is to have this option type replace on all the time. Then underneath you have two more options. Flight direction, which I recommend staying horizontal, but feel free to play around with that, and the flight momentum, which I like to have around 50%, but that's my personal preference. You can try different values to see what fits your playstyle. With all those basics out of the way, we can start learning the tools that will actually help us build, which are the ones over here. If we scroll to that new slot and press left alt, instead of opening the context menu we saw before, it will open up a new slider with all these tools: Move, Clone, Stack, Smear, Extrude, Erase, and Symmetry. Let me show you how to use this. The first one is called Move, and it's the most basic one but also the most useful. To use this, we need to set the first block by left clicking on it. That will highlight the block, and then we need to right click to set the second point. This will create a selection box. Once that's done, we can start scrolling with the middle button to move our build around. This movement is relative to the player. That means that it will depend on where you are looking. So if I want to move it to the left, I need to look in that direction and then scroll. If I want it to go up, I need to look up, and so on. After you are done moving, you can either cancel with left click to bring it back to the original position, or you can confirm with right click to effectively move the blocks. Sometimes when moving a build, you need to move them a large distance. That's when scrolling can be a bit tedious. For that, after selecting and moving, you can just fly to the new location and press the middle button to bring the build automatically to that place. And what's super important, not only for this tool but for many others, is that you can undo your actions with Ctrl-C. Now, while moving builds or parts of a build around, we might need to rotate them. So after selecting, as we saw previously, we can press Ctrl-R to rotate the build 90 degrees clockwise. If we look from above, you can see that more clearly by following the yellow wool. The downside of this rotation is that it only works horizontally. We will see how to rotate in other directions later on. With Move, we can also mirror or flip the build. This one is a bit more tricky because it depends on where we are facing. So if we look in this direction and press Ctrl F, it will flip the build across our axis, while if we look down and press Ctrl F, it will flip it upside down. My recommendation here is to just play around until you get the orientation that you want. Most of the time the builds that we need to select are not perfect cubes, so when we try to select with 2 points, it just won't work to select the entire thing at once. For that, we have two options. The first one, which is the one that I prefer, is to just make a basic selection as before, and then use the middle click to extend that selection as many times as you need, to end up with the entire build selected. The other option is to use commands. While we have the Move tool selected, we can fly to the first point and type // pos1. That will set that location as the first corner of the selection. Then we can fly to the other corner and do //pose2 to set the second position and define our selection box. If we press left alt, we can access the other tools. The next one down the list is the Clone tool. This one works in the exact same way as the Move tool. We first need to left click and right click to make our selection and then scroll to start moving, with the difference that this one will make a copy of the build prior to moving it. We can flip, rotate and do all the other things as well. Something else to consider here is that over here we can find the option Copy Air. By default it's set to off, but if we change that to on when we make the copy, it will also consider the air blocks, meaning that it will destroy any pre-existing blocks where we paste the copy. In our case, the red wool will be gone, while if we do it without that option, you can see that they are preserved. The next one is the Stack tool. First, we need to select our build, that works exactly in the same way as for the previous tools, and then we scroll to repeat the build many times in a given direction. That direction will be dependent on where we are looking. Something to consider with this tool is that it will destroy any blocks that it comes across in its way. The stack can do many different things depending on the build and the selection we make. It's not the same to select this build entirely and stack it up than to select half of it and stack it horizontally and then up. It's a super useful tool, but you need to play around with it to see what results you can achieve. After stack we have smear, and this is very similar to stack, but it has some differences that make it perfect for many cases. One main difference is that the smear will stop whenever it finds pre-existing blocks. So in this case you can see how it stops once it finds the red wool instead of destroying them like stack would do. This is great to quickly fill in irregular shapes. The other main difference is that if we move it in more than one direction, it will smear the build in a diagonal, which is super useful to quickly create diagonal walls or roofs. Up next we got Extrude. The way this works is pretty simple. You just need to right click or left click on a block if you want to extrude it or shrink it respectively. This depends on the block type and on the face of the block you are clicking. It's not the same to click on the top face or the side face. A warning here, be careful when using this tool. If you accidentally extrude a large surface, like this one from the super flat world, it might lag or crash your game. The erase tool is pretty straightforward. You need to first make a selection of what you want to erase, as we saw before, and then press delete on your keyboard to get rid of it. You can also just right click to erase a small box of blocks of the same type that are connected to each other. It's worth mentioning here that you can do the same with the Move tool. Once you have a selection with the Move tool, you can also press delete on your keyboard to get rid of it quickly. The Symmetry tool is a bit different from the rest, but it's very powerful once you get used to it. The way it works is that first you need to right click to set a symmetry point, which is this tiny light grey cube. You can place this in the center of a block, between two blocks, or in a corner between four blocks. Let's say for now that we place it here in the center. Then we can press Ctrl R to activate the rotations. You can see how the cube turns yellow and now it has a green circle around. That symbolizes that the rotations are turned on. So now if we go ahead and place a block next to this point, we can see that it will place another 3 blocks, rotating them around this main point, taking the orientation into consideration. Then we can turn the rotations off by pressing Ctrl R again, and if we press Ctrl F this time, it will make these arrows appear. We have blue, red and green arrows, depending on the direction we were looking when we pressed Ctrl F. You can have one of them, two, or all at the same time. The flip basically mimics everything we do on one side to the other side. This works either for placing and breaking blocks, and it's compatible with other features like the replace mode. I insist it's a bit tricky to get used to this, but once you understand it, it's a tool that can save you a lot of time when building symmetrical builds and detailing, because you only need to work on one corner and the others will be built up automatically as you go. Then to get rid of the symmetry point, you just need to press delete, or if you need, you can change the tool to something else, like clone. Use that for what you need, and when you come back, your symmetry point should still be there. To enter the editor menu, we need to press right shift. Here, before touching anything, we need to understand how to move around in this menu. For a start, you can move by pressing WASD on your keyboard, but in contrast to regular Creative Flight, this will move you in the direction you are facing, or the camera direction. For example, if I look down and press W to go forward, in regular Creative it moves forward, but in the editor menu it will move down. Then you can find the speed slider as well in this menu, right here on the bottom right corner. It's smaller, but you can use this to adjust your speed from 1 to 10, and you can control right click to override the limit and input any number. On top of the basic WASD movements, in this menu you can use your mouse clicks to adjust your camera. With left click you can click any point and drag to rotate the world around you. See how the rock that I click follows my mouse. On the other hand, with right click you can click and drag to move you or the camera around. It doesn't matter where you click, you can just drag to spin around, face the direction you wanna go, and then use W to get closer or S to move away. Another way of doing that is by scrolling in or out with your mouse wheel. That way you can quickly zoom in and out on the place you are looking. The last two camera movements are performed by holding left control plus left click or right click. The first one, holding left control plus left click, will allow you to click on any point of the world and orbit around it to see it from a different angle. This depends on your distance to the point. If you are further apart, the distance you move while orbiting around is larger, so be careful not to click on any point very far away. The other one, holding left control plus right click, will move the world in the direction you send it to, left, right, up or down. As with most of the things in Axiom, you need to practice to get used to it, and the camera movements are a tough challenge for many at the beginning. So if you are struggling with this, always remember that you can simply get out of the menu with right shift, move regularly as you would do in Creative to get to where you need, and then open the menu again to keep using the tools. One more thing before getting into the tools, sometimes while using this menu we can accidentally click somewhere and mess things up, maybe lose a window or an important part of this menu. When that happens, you can go up here to Window and click on Restore Default Layout to bring everything back and fix any possible issues. Let's now begin diving into the tools. For that we can separate them into 4 different categories: Selection tools, Painting tools, Shaping tools, and Miscellaneous tools. The selection tools are very important when building with Axiom. These tools are the Magic Select, the Box Select, the Freehand Select, and the Lasso Select. This one is the fastest and most powerful one. With its default mode, we can right-click on any block to select all the blocks of the same type that are connected with each other. When the blocks are selected, you will see a yellow outline around them. You can right-click on another block to add them to the selection as well, and so on. Once we have something selected, we can do many things with it. For a start, we can copy it with Ctrl+C. That will save a copy in the clipboard. We can find a preview of that on the top right corner. Then we can press Ctrl+V to paste it somewhere in the world. While the build is in this holographic state, we can rotate it in different directions using the handles, move it around with the arrows, flip it with Ctrl+F, and once it's on the position we want, we can confirm by pressing Enter. We can also select something and delete it by pressing the Delete key on the keyboard. Or, if we want to clear a selection, we can press Enter to get rid of it quickly. If you don't remember what you can do or what are the keybinds, whenever you select something you can find a hint in this box that will appear on the top right corner. Here you will find all the options we mentioned plus a few more. Now, if we take a look at the tool options, we can find many things to play around with. First is the Compare. By default it is set to block, which means that it will select all the blocks of the same type. However, we can change that to any, for instance. So now when we right click, it will select the entire thing as long as it is connected. Another useful option here is to set the compare mode to material, which will select all the blocks and its smaller variants, like in here the deep slate with its walls and slabs, or the acacia instead. Then right below we have the limit. This is the amount of blocks to select. We can increase it for larger builds or decrease it if we want to make a smaller selection. Then we have the range. Increasing this number will ignore air blocks up to a certain distance. So in this case, even if the purple is not connected to the other blocks, we can select it all together by setting the range to 5. Right underneath we have these 5 options, which are incredibly powerful. The first one is surface only. If we turn that option on and select our wool sphere, we can't see any difference at first. However, if we were to delete those blocks, we can see that it only removed the outer layer, or the surface of the build. We can see that even better if we cut and move it instead. Then we have the up and down options. These are all on by default, but if for instance we turn down off, the magic selection will only select the blocks that are above our cursor when we click. And the exact opposite will happen if we only have down on. If we turn both off, you can see that it will select only a horizontal line. That is because we have the horizontal option on. If we go ahead and turn that off, the magic selection will only select a single block. The last option we will find here is the mode. By default, it's set to add, meaning that every time we click, it will add to the selection. That can be changed to replace, meaning that every time we click, it will create a new selection and forget the previous one. Subtract is another mode for which you will need to have a pre-existing selection. So anything you select with this mode will remove from the pre-existing selection. And at last we have intersect. This is very similar. We also need a pre-existing selection, but the difference is that this time the new selection will merge with the previous one, but only where they both meet. The next selection tool is the box select, and it's a bit more simple. As the name says, we can draw a box and everything that falls inside will be selected. For that we need to right click on the first point and then move the mouse to start creating the box. The important thing here is to begin creating the box. Even if it doesn't select the entire thing at first, then you will see 2 smaller points on the corners and 1 on the center. You can click on them and use the arrows to adjust the size of the box in every direction with more precision, or click the one in the center to move the box around. Once your box covers the entire build, you have to press enter to confirm the selection, and you will see the yellow lines on the edges. If you don't want to draw your box manually, you can go to the tool options, start with a few blocks and then change the size in the different directions over here. If you go beyond the values, you can always click the shrink button to get rid of the unnecessary air blocks. You can also change the input mode from position and size to pose 1 and pose 2, where you need to enter the coordinates of both opposite corners. You can do that by hand if you know the coordinates, or you can move your player and click set to grab those coordinates automatically. The Freehand Select is pretty straightforward. When you right click and drag, you will select with the shape of the brush you choose. You got a spherical shape, a cube, a cylinder and many others, and the radius or size of the brush depending on which one you choose. It's fast, but it's not very precise. We will see some good use cases for this selection type later on. The Lasso Select is an interesting one. You can click on multiple points to draw a selection in any shape, and then press enter to confirm. Or you can click and drag if you want to draw something more irregular. Once you press enter, it's going to select everything in the direction you are facing. Now, if we take a look at the tool options, we can see that the depth is set to 1. That means that this is only selected one block wherever it touches. We can increase that if we want to select more, for instance to delete something entirely. Or you can also move the slider to negative values, what this will do is that it will select air blocks between you and the blocks it finds. So if I face a flat surface and draw something with a negative depth, you can select a shape like this, that then can be filled in, for instance, with a stone block, which can be very useful for terraforming, and we will see more of that later on. Moving on to the painting tools, we have three main ones: the regular painter tool, the noise painter, and the gradient painter. There's also technically the Biome Painter and the script brush, but they are way different, so we'll see them separately. For these three painter tools, we will go over the basics of how to use each one of them, and we will get into more details once we get to the examples in part 3. First, the painter tool. At first sight, this is the most simple one. Here under tool options, you can select the brush shape and the size, which will depend on the brush shape we chose. Then if we right click somewhere in the world, you can see that it will paint with stone. That's because we have stone as our active block here to the right. If we click there and change it to something else, like spruce planks, we will now be painting with that. Now, something very useful here is that you can hold down left control and click and drag with the mouse wheel to make your brush larger or smaller as we go. That is a quick way of adapting the size without having to use the slider over here, and it's something that works for every tool that has a brush. Under the options we have Mask Surface, which is on by default, meaning that it's only painting the surface and not the inside. So we need to change that if we want to paint everything, which by the way can also be done by directly dragging the active block into the build, or if we have it, a selection. The other option is Type Replace. This does something very useful and it works as follows. Let's say we have this beautiful house with spruce planks, oak fences and a cherry roof, and we want to change the roof to mangrove. We can first select the roof with a magic select, but now if we paint with mangrove stairs, you can see that it doesn't preserve the orientation. What we need to do is to turn this option on, copy properties, and then paint. Or another option is to use the mangrove plank and turn the option Type Replace to achieve the same effect. Under Mode we have other useful options. Ignore them for now, we will see them better in the examples later on. The Noise Painter works in a similar way. We have a brush shape and a size to modify, and then we right click to paint. However, we have another option here called Scale. That changes the scale of the noise pattern that we are using to paint. And what is that? That is this thing over here, which by default is set to simplex. We can choose from a bunch of different ones and see a preview of the pattern right below. The best way of understanding the scale is by changing its value and trying it out in the world, until you get what you want. You can always undo it very quickly with Ctrl+C. Now the blocks used in this case are not the ones in the active block slot, but instead these ones over here, where you can see by default it's set to stone 50%. We can click on the plus icon and add as many different blocks as we want for the pattern, and change their percentages. For example, we might want to paint with stone, calcite and air. So we select all that, a noise pattern like Voronoi edges, and just scale, and just click on the world to paint. A small yet very important thing to notice here is that if we select all blocks that have the same variants, for example cobblestone and tuff, which both have stairs, slabs and walls, we can find then the option Type Replace at the bottom, which will allow us to do the same that we did with the painter tool, and paint stairs and walls preserving the orientation, while at the same time using the noise pattern. The gradient painter is an interesting one, and it has a few differences from the other ones in the way it works. First, you need to click 2 points to set the gradient direction, and on the second point hold and drag to paint. So click first, click second, hold and drag. Then similarly to the noise painter, you can add as many blocks as you want to the gradient, and on top of that you can also change the interpolation method of the gradient. You can change it between nearest, linear and Bezier. For most of the cases you will need linear interpolation. Bezier has a more noisy transition and nearest doesn't have a transition at all. Then the shape of the gradient can also be changed between plane and sphere, with the sphere being a concentric pattern. And finally we have locking, which allows us to choose the position we want to lock, meaning that they will remain there even after painting. For example, if I lock position 1, The first point will remain there after I finish, so I can select a different second position to make a different gradient starting from the same point. Then, if we choose to lock position 1 and position 2, once we set a gradient direction, it will be preserved even after we finish painting. This is useful when the build is too large to paint on one go. You can select the direction first, paint a segment, spin around and paint the other side, always preserving the exact same gradient direction. You can then undo to remove the gradient positions and select new ones. The next classification of tools are the shaping tools, or drawing tools as they are called in the documentation. These are the ones that will allow us to create things and give them shape. Now, there are many tools that fall into this category. The Freehand Draw is the most simple one. We basically right-click and drag to paint shapes using the active block. We also can choose between brushes of different shapes and sizes. When we right-click with the Sculpt Draw, it will add blocks using the surface normal. What that means is that if we have a flat surface, it will pull blocks of that type upwards. But notice how when we get to these vertical stone walls, the direction changes. If in the options we select invert, the tool is going to remove blocks instead of adding. The Mask Y option will make it only add blocks in the vertical direction, and the noise makes the result smoother. The Rock tool is one of my favorites. The way it works is very similar to the Freehand Draw. We get a brush shape and a size, and we right-click in the world to place blocks using our active block. What makes this one particularly powerful is the fact that it will add random noise that we can configure in the tool options to end up with different blobs, that if chosen correctly can resemble rock shapes. At the same time we get smoothing and melding. Increasing the smoothing will yield a softer result in the shape itself, while increasing the meld strength will modify how much the rock we create will merge with the pre-existing terrain. Basically, a stronger meld will smooth the edges of the rocks to the ground. Now, some of my favorite brush shapes to make rocks are the sphere for the more classic blobs, the cube or cuboid for when I need something more sharp around the edges, and the cone, which tends to have the best result for a rock in my opinion. The Weld Tool uses the active block to add shapes and help smooth the edges between different surfaces. You can select a brush shape and a size and then right-click to add terrain in the surface you want to join together. Up next we have Melt, and this is an incredibly useful one. As the name suggests, we can right-click with this tool to melt away the blocks. Similar to the previous ones, we have different brush shapes, sizes and the strength. The cool thing about this tool is that it will always have this smoothness to it. The Shape tool is the one to go for when we want to create perfect geometrical shapes, like spheres, boxes, pyramids and so on. There's a lot to unpack here. First, we got the category of the shapes, where we can choose between solid and flat. Starting with the solid shapes, we got many different ones to choose from. Depending on which one you choose, you will get different parameters for the size. For instance, if we choose a sphere, we just need to select the diameter, while if we select a cylinder, we get to choose diameter and height. To place the shape in the world, we need to first right-click anywhere and then use the arrows to move it around to where we want it. You can also scroll with the mouse wheel to move it around in the direction you are facing. Once you are happy with your position, you have to press Enter to confirm the placement. As for the flat shapes, we get a disc, a plane, a polygon with a minimum of 3 sides, a super ellipse and a spiral. What's great from this tool is that we can rotate these shapes in more than just 90-degree angles. By dragging the handles around, we can place these shapes in any orientation, and most of the time they will look fairly well. At the same time, you can find and open the rotation tab under the tool options and input any number that you want for the rotations by control-clicking on the sliders. So if you want a 45-degree angle, you can do that with no problem. And if you make a mistake and want to come back to the basic orientation, you can always click the Reset Rotation button. At the same time, the size of the shapes can be customized in every direction. If we click Separate XY Seat, we will unlock the different sliders to change the size in the X, Y and Z dimensions separately. Under Modifiers, we got the Hollow option that will make our shapes hollowed. And right underneath we get Metaball. If we turn that option on, the shape we place will merge with its surroundings. So if we drag this sphere down, it will start to smoothly splatter into the ground. With the range, you can customize how much or how far you want your shapes to blend. It's super satisfying to watch. Then we get a few more settings, ignore this for now, except for maybe the keep existing one, which will be useful for when we want to place shapes without destroying pre-existing blocks. The path tool is another important one because of its versatility. The way it works is quite simple, you just need to right-click in the world to add points to your path, which will be connected using the active block. And finally, just confirm by pressing enter. In the options we can find different types of curves, like a line, a Bezier curve or a catenary. These are the shapes that are going to fit into the different points we added. You can also tick on loop, which will connect the last point to the first one. And the option uses stairs and slabs, where if the block you are using has those variants, this will smooth out the shape along the path using those blocks. Then we have the shape of the path. By default it's a sphere, and we can see that if we increase the radius of the path. But we also have the option to use flat, which will do something like this, and here we can also change the depth in this case. And finally we have the custom clipboard shape, which will use what's on our clipboard over here. For this we need to first copy something with Ctrl+C. Now, going back to the default sphere shape, we can see that we can click on different points of our path, modify their position, and it will tell us over here which point it is and what are its coordinates. We can also take the option override block to change the block type of that segment, or override radius to change the size of that point. Or if we want to get rid of that point, we just need to click on remove. Now down at the bottom we have 3 more options. Keep existing so the path won't destroy pre-existing blocks, extend to ground to extend the blocks all the way to the bottom, and paste copy, which will allow us to place the blocks in the world but still modify the path points to create a different one. The modeling tool is very similar to the path tool, at least in the way it works. You can see that if we right click it will add points and create a path. The difference with this is that we can press this button over here that says add row, and now we can create another path which will connect with the previous one to create a surface. We can add as many rows and points as we want to make the surfaces as detailed as we need. And then we just hit enter to confirm. By default the shape of the surface is a flat surface, but we can change that to Catmull Rom or a Bezier surface. The other 4 work in a different way. You don't need to set the rows for those. I recommend you try them out by yourself to see what each one of them do. In general, the first 3 are the ones that I use the most, and the rest of the options you'll find here are very similar to the ones we saw on the path tool. If you want to terraform, this is the tool that you need. The elevation tool is very powerful. With all the default settings, you need to right click and hold on the terrain to begin raising it. You can increase the radius here in the slider or with left control middle click and drag. Now if you see here we have the mode, which by default is set to rise, but we can also lower, flatten but only up, and flatten but only down. With these 5 modes you have more than enough to create many shapes for terraforming, from spiky mountains and valleys to terraces and craters. On top of that you can increase the rate to make it work faster, and the fall off. This basically tells the brush how strong it is and where. The first one would be uniformly strong, and the other ones are more spiky in the center of the brush. Playing around with them is the best way to learn their differences. And the last thing of this tool that sometimes is overlooked is this button over here called Load Heightmap. This will allow you to import an external heightmap. I will put the link to the ones that I use on the description below, with credits to the creators so you can find them as well. Basically click that button and find the folder with your heightmaps. Choose the one that you want and you should see a preview right here. With them you can basically modify your brush shape to build up realistic mountains, geometrical patterns and many other things, making this tool the most powerful for terraforming. Up next we have the Slope tool, and this does what the name says. It creates slopes between 2 points. You need to click on the first point, then on the second point and hold. you will see a plane appear indicating the inclination of your slope. Then if you drag in any direction, the terrain will raise to create that slope smoothly. If the radius is bigger, you will raise more terrain. The different modes here are similar to the ones for the elevation tool. We have raise by default, lower, which will bring terrain down, or both. Then the shape by default is a plane, but we also have the option to do a cone, which in contrast with the plane, the cone orientation will depend on the order of the points. And finally, we have the fall-offs, which are the same we saw for the elevation tool. The smooth tool is very easy to use and it's one of the most useful ones. With this tool you get a brush shape, a size and a strength, and then you can right click, hold and drag to smooth out everything the brush finds on its way, independent of the block type. The tool works super well, and we get 3 options: melt, stable and grow. By default it's set to stable, meaning that it will presave the same amount of blocks while smoothing. Then melt will smooth but getting rid of blocks if it needs to, and grow, which will add blocks instead. We also have the block ratio, which has a similar effect if we go above or below the 100%, but in general I would keep this at 100. The next 2 tools are in a way the opposite of the smooth tool, since they will add noise to the build. First we have Distort. With this we right click and drag to create those noise patterns into the terrain. These blobs can be larger or smaller depending on the scale we choose, and we can make them stronger by increasing the distance, which at the same time we can separate the axis to make it stronger only in certain directions. The Roughen will add this smaller scale noise all around. You can increase the ratio to make the effect stronger, and check these boxes whether you wanted to add or remove blocks, or both. The next one is called Shatter, and it can be used to create these broken down patterns on your build. Here you can customize the scale of the pattern and the width of the cracks. If you want, you can also click here for the tool to use your active block instead of air to fill in the cracks. And at the bottom you can also choose individual axes in which you want the tool to work. Setting this to Y, you can have purely vertical holes, or if you want to place them on a wall, you can choose any of the other axes. The effects achieved with this tool can be very cool looking. I definitely recommend playing around with it. The last tool from the shaping category is Extrude. The way this one works is very simple. You just need to right click on a surface to extrude it or shrink it if you choose the shrink mode. Then we have the displace option, which if turned on will move any surface that is 1 block thick instead of stacking them. On top of that you get the different way of comparing, similar to the Magic Select. Here we can reduce or increase the limit to determine how many blocks we want to modify, and the count, which will allow us to extrude more than 1 layer at a time. The last category of tools are the miscellaneous ones. These are more varied and have more niche applications, but regardless of that, they can still be very useful when used creatively. First of all, we have the Biome Painter. This is like the Painter tool. We select a brush shape and a radius, but then down below, we can click here and choose any biome from this drop-down menu. Then when we right-click in the world, we will be painting with that biome, which is great to change the color of grass and water. We also have 2 more options. One is Visualize Biome. This will turn on and off the boxes of different colors depending on the biome. And we can also choose Fill Vertically to fill in the chunk all the way up with the biome we chose. Here you can load custom brushes coded in Lua script to perform different operations. If you know how to code, you can get very creative with this, or if you don't, no worries, you can still use the default ones and some others made by the community. To mention a few, from the default ones we have Clear Foliage, which will assist us when we need to get rid of grass or trees in an area. Then we have Grass, to add a random amount of grass and tall grass where we click. Or Leafy Bushes, to add small blobs of leaves all around. For the custom ones made by the community, I will link the ones that I know in the description so you can get them as well. And to install them, all you need to do is to place them inside the folder under Config, Axiom, Tool Presets, Script Brush. Place the files there, and after reloading you should see them in game. Up next we have the Stamp tool. This one allows us to paste many different builds all together and with random orientations. You have two options to make this work. Let's say we have these three presets over here. We can first copy one of them with Ctrl+C. Now that you see it on the clipboard at the top, we can click this button Add Clipboard on the Stamp tool, and that will add that tree to the tool. Now we can repeat that for all the other trees until we have the 4 of them loaded into the Stamp tool. The other option is to save these trees as blueprints. To do so, we need to follow a similar process and copy a tree individually. Once it's on the clipboard, we can press Ctrl+P to save it as a blueprint. Here we choose a name, and when we press save, we can choose the folder where we want it to be saved. So then, once you have all the builds you want saved as a blueprint, you can go to the Stamp tool and press on Add Blueprint. That should open the default blueprint folder, where you can quickly click to add them one by one, or hold left shift while clicking to add more than one at a time. Once you have all the builds that you want loaded into the Stamp tool, you just need to right click and drag to place them in your world. A few useful settings from here are the mean spacing. Increasing this will make the builds be more spread out, and reducing it will make them cluster together. The place mode can be immediate or deferred. With deferred, we can manually tweak the position of the builds placed. The direction is set to top by default, but if we need to place blueprints respective to a roof or a wall, we can change the direction to achieve that result. Of course, the builds should need to be rotated first. These two options right here are on by default. The first one is to rotate the builds randomly, and the second one is to flip them horizontally. If you turn them off, the builds will all have the same orientation. Finally, we have Keep Existing, which won't destroy pre-existing blocks. And Extend Foundation to Ground, which will extend the last layer of blocks of each build all the way to the ground. Be careful because this might look weird depending on the build you use. And of course, here you can tweak the percentages of each build individually. The text tool is one that I love and it's very simple to use. Over here you need to type in anything that you want your text to say and right click to place it in the world. Then you can choose the direction in which you want it to be displayed. The size, which in general works better for larger sizes, but still does a decent job with smaller ones. And then you have this option to use the built-in font, the default one included in Axiom. Or if you turn this option off, you can actually select a custom font. I have one with a Minecraft style. You can move it around to position it where you want, change the active block over here and hit enter to confirm. The next tool is called FloodFill, and it's the one to go to when we need to fill in large ponds with water, with lava, or with any block really. It's very simple to use. Here in the limit you choose how many blocks you want to place, and then the direction. By default the direction is set to down and horizontal, so if we go ahead and right click here, it will fill in this hole with our active block depending on the height where we click. Then if we turn on the up option, you can see that it will make this sort of pyramid. This is useful when we need to fill in a hollow shape, for instance. If we turn off horizontal, it will make a vertical line instead, which might be useful for something. The next one is Fluid Ball. With this, we can simulate the flow of liquids like water and lava. You can choose a brush shape, a radius, the quality of the simulation, and the flow length. Then when you paint around, it should place water flowing. Be careful here, because if you paint a large area, it might take a while to perform the simulation. Down here you have a bunch of options, and if you hover over them, it will tell you what each of them do. For most cases, I will keep the default settings. Something that I really like here is the use of the snow fluid type to create smooth fields of snow for mountain landscapes. The last one of the list is the Modify tool. This tool is incredibly useful for many different things, but it might be a bit tricky to fully understand everything that you can do with it. The tool has 4 different modes: Revolve, Translate Copies, Rotate Copies, and Twist. Now, they all work in a similar way. We first need to select some blocks, and then we right click to perform an action. If the mode is set to revolve, this will rotate the build around the point where we click, just like that. And we will see a preview with the green and red lines. Here you can change the angle if you don't want to do a full loop, and the axis in which you want to perform the rotation. And at the bottom there's this option, Add Translation, that will allow the build to move at the same time that it rotates. For instance, if we make it go 7 in the Y direction, it will create this spiral going up. If we go to the mode Rotate Copies, this will do something similar to the Revolve, with the difference that it won't make the full loop, but instead create copies and rotate them around the point. Here you can choose how many copies you want, and by default they will be separated equidistantly or the same distance. However, you can change that to set custom angles if you want and do more crazy stuff. And again, here you can also add translation to do what we did for the Revolve. The next mode is Translate Copies. This one works similarly to the previous one. We just need to choose how many copies we want to create and the direction in every coordinate. It's like a more fancy version of the Stack tool. The type by default is set to relative, but we can change it to absolute, and that effect is more noticeable with a larger build. The last mode is Twist, and for this one we just need to input any degree here and the axis direction in which we want the build to be twisted. For instance, with the one here, it will twist it across the vertical direction. I won't lie, it's super fun to play around with this one. Now that we have an idea of what all of the main tools do, we can start talking about the tool masks. You can find the tool mask menu at the top and open it by clicking on Edit. This menu is where things get interesting. All the tools we saw before are amazing, but most of the times, just by themselves, they are not enough. To give you an example, we may have this mix of blocks as a grassy area, and we want to change the dark prismarine for something like green terracotta. With the tools alone, it would be a tedious process of painting every pocket individually. However, with a simple tool mask, we can make the process so much easier and paint all the dark prismarine with 1 or 2 clicks. That is the core of the tool masks. They essentially modify what the tools do by setting up limitations for them, allowing us to do more specific tasks. So to set a tool mask, we need to open this menu, where we will find a big empty box in the middle and a bunch of smaller boxes to the right. 4 of them under the Logic category and the rest under the Masks category. If you hover over them, it will tell you what each of them do, so there's no need to remember exactly what they are for. It's more important here to understand the logic behind them so that you can use and mix them in creative ways. For a tool mask to work, we need to drag one of these small boxes into the big one at the top, where a yellow line will appear. That has set up a mask of block equals stone, which is the most basic one. And while this window is open, it will work, which we can minimize by clicking here. The tool mask will make it so all of the tools from here will now work only if the target block are stone blocks. And if not, they won't do anything. Selections won't work, painting won't work, elevation won't work unless we have stone. Of course, we can change the block we are targeting by clicking here and selecting a different type of block. Not only we can set up masks that target specific blocks, we can also set masks to target relative positions to other blocks. 2 important ones are the above and the below mask. If we grab the above, you will see that it now says above equals stone. That means that now our tools will only work on those blocks that have a stone block above them. For example here, where if we paint, you will clearly see how the only blocks changed are this one right underneath the stone and nothing else. The opposite effect can be achieved if we use a below mask instead. That will now make our tools target only blocks that have stone below them. So, if we want to paint on top of a certain block, we need to use the below mask, while if we want to paint underneath a certain block, we need to use an above mask. Then we have other masks that work in a similar way. The near mask, which will let us choose a radius or a distance, and it's basically telling the tools to only work on blocks that are in proximity of a certain given block. The neighbor mask is very similar, but now the blocks that the tool will target need to be touching stone. And finally, the adjacent mask will target blocks that are touching stone, but only horizontally. With this, you can now understand the logic. The biome mask is pretty self-explanatory. You just choose the biome you want from the list, and now the tools will only work on that specific biome. Then we have the Y level mask. This one is quite useful. For a start, you can just choose any Y level, so the tools will only work at that specific height, Y equals 64 for instance. Then you can also click on the equal sign and find a few more options. The one with the exclamation point, meaning not equal, will target everything except for that specific Y level. Then we have less than, meaning tools will target blocks below that specific Y level. Greater than will target blocks above that specific level, and then less equal and greater equal, which will do the same but including that specific Y level. Now, this is not limited only to the vertical coordinate. You can also come here and type an X or a Z to change it to any of the horizontal coordinates. Actually, here in this box you can type anything, but if it doesn't make sense, the tool mask menu will let you know. The next one is the angle mask. This is an interesting one. This mask will check for a specific angle and a range. If we hover over the angle word, it will tell us that 90 degrees means up, 0 is horizontal and -90 is down. So, let's say we have a small cliff, and we want to paint separately the vertical cliff face from the top flat area. Then this is the tool we need to use. We would want, for instance, set the angle to 90 and a range of 15. So the Painter tool can only affect the flat areas of our terrain, where the angle is roughly facing up, or 90 degrees. That's why we have the range, because it's never perfect, so we can tweak that to something like 30 to target more of the top. And then we will do the opposite and change it to 0, so we can target the vertical faces of the cliff. This is a very simple example, but when builds get larger and more complex, painting following these logics can make things easier and faster. The last three masks are in selection, which basically works in pair with the selection tools. We would need to first make a selection, so now the tools will only work for blocks inside that selection. It's not very clear how this can be useful since that's exactly what the selections do already, but we will see an example later on. Then we have Can See Sky, which is a simple one. With this one the tools will only affect blocks that have sky directly above, or that don't have any blocks above them at any point. The surface mask will only target the blocks that are on the surface of a build, and not inside. Now, I did not forget about the first 4 small boxes here. I left them for the end because they are not masks in themselves, they are logic conditions instead. Now, if you've studied or read anything about logic in math or in circuits before, this might be obvious to you. But if you haven't, this might be a bit tougher to understand. In any case, let's break this down step by step. Now, in the same way that the masks imposed restrictions for the tools to work, the logic conditions will impose restrictions over the masks themselves, allowing us to combine them in creative and logical ways. Basically, we are adding more conditions to our conditions. First, we have the OR logic, and it says, if any input is true, then the output is true. What does that mean? Well, let's first drag it over here. We can notice that it has a small gap in the middle. That's where we need to bring in any of the masks we saw before. Let's grab a simple one, block equals stone. Now if we read here, it says block equals stone. And that's no different from just using the mask individually. However, if we bring in another block mask into this and change the block to something else, like moss for example, now the text has changed. And remember what it said, if any input is true, then the output is true. This means that when we use any of the tools, we will not only target stone blocks, but also moss blocks. Because in a way, what this is doing is checking if the block we are trying to affect is first a stone block. If it's true, if it's a stone block, the tool will work. If it's not, it will check if it's moss. And if that's true, the tool will also work. Basically, any condition that you put inside your logic will make the tool work as long as at least one of them is satisfied or true. And by the way, you can put as many conditions as you want in here. Then we have the AND logic. Again, here you can put as many masks as you want, but this one says, all inputs must be true for the output to be true. That means that in this case, everything that we put inside here needs to be satisfied at the same time for the tool to work. So if we do something like before, where we had block equal stone and block equal moss, that will never work, because there is no block in the game that is stone and moss simultaneously. This all means that we need to be more careful with what we place inside the AND logic, because they need to be compatible. For example, we can target blocks of red wool that have stone below them. And notice how now the Painter tool will only paint on the blocks that satisfy both conditions. And by the way, you can deactivate and save some tool masks for later by simply dragging them underneath. The NOT logic is a bit more simple. It basically does the opposite of the condition we place inside. Or as it says, it inverts the input. So if we place block equal stone inside here, we are basically telling the tools to target any blocks except for stone. Another use case is with the InSelection mask. We can first make a selection and then use the NOT logic with the InSelection inside to target blocks outside of the selection we made. It's also worth mentioning here that we can mix the ANDs with the ORs and the NOTs and all the masks together to really make a mess of conditions. The offset mask is the most difficult to explain and understand. In a way, it's similar to the above, below or the near masks we saw before. It says offsets the target position affecting all masks inside. The way this works basically is we can place other conditions here, for instance a simple one like block equal stone, and then we have 3 zeros. Those are for the X, Y and Z positions respectively. We can change those numbers and for example let's change the Y to a 1. We will now, instead of target stone blocks, target blocks that have a stone block one position vertically to them. In other words, above them. But that's basically the same result that we could achieve with the above mask. And yes, however, the advantage of this is not only that we can put any numbers here to make it go in weird diagonals, but we can also add other conditions inside and achieve very complex effects. Now that we've seen all the different tools and the tool masks, we can go through a few examples and use cases so that you can understand how the different tools and operations can be used to build organics, structures and terrain. Let's begin with organics. The main tool that will help us to create organics is the Path tool. With it, we can start adding points and give shape to the trunk of a tree and its branches, for example. Simply by modifying the radius of different points, we can quickly end up with a very stylized tree trunk. This tool is also useful for wireframing the basic bone structure of a human organic, that you can later on use as a guide and fill it in to build a statue. Or we can also use the Path tool to create the shape of the wings of a dragon. This tool with all its configurations is the best option to get the first steps of your organic in place. Up next, we can also use the Shape tool to create a sphere, for instance, and use it as the base for the head of our organic, the jaw, its hands, or even shoulders. When it comes to trees, we can use the Shape tool as well to create the different leaf clusters. By using the supersphere shape and the option Separate X, Y and Z, we can get these ellipsoids and place them around the branches to create our canopy. My preferred way of doing leaves, however, is by turning on the option Metaball and create a few clusters against a flat surface. Then we can copy them with Ctrl+C and paste them over at the tree with Ctrl+V. Once they are there, we can turn the option Unrock Rotation at the top to rotate them in any angle and direction that we want. That way, after tinkering around for a bit, we can end up with a very nice tree. Sometimes, however, while using these clusters, we might need a smaller blob. For that, we can use this button called Rotate/Scale. That will open up a menu with a bunch of options. My recommendation here is to use the nearest neighbors interpolation, where we can set any rotation or scale. In the scale, we can change it for every individual axis, and for instance, we can set the X and Z to 0.5, which will reduce its horizontal scale to half the size, and the Y we can leave it on 1 to keep its vertical scale. Then if we press this button, we can see how the size of our blob changes and we can fit it better on the tree. This scaling function is great to do all the adjustments you need to the builds. To give you another example, we can scale up the wing frame we did for the dragon. by first selecting it, cutting it with Ctrl X, and while it's on the holographic form, we can find the Rotate Scale option, where under Nearest Neighbor we can choose the parameters to scale up in the different directions. Sometimes we might build too large or too small when doing organics, so being able to readjust the scale and orientation quickly is very useful. Of course, it's not going to be perfectly smooth, but it's a great starting point. Another powerful tool for organics is the modeling tool, which we can use to follow the frame previously done with the path tool. That way we can very quickly get the dragon wings filled in, for instance. On top of that, we can also use the modify tool with the twist option to make it look more dynamic if that's what we need for our organic. When it comes to painting the tree leaves, for instance, we can use the noise painter and choose a mix of azalea leaves, oak, birch and air. And the noise pattern of splatter works really well in my opinion. We can turn on the anisotropic option to make it very small in the vertical direction, so then when we paint, we end up with this really nice mix of air and leaves. The tool masks are incredibly powerful to give character to the tree. For example, we can use a tool mask of block equal air and above equal lime, and a white noise pattern to randomly add small extra leaves underneath the blobs we previously made. Then we can randomize the pattern and add more to create this dripping down leaves style for the tree. Another option to create leaves fully with tool masks is to use a near mask, and then paint with a noise painter around the tips of the branches to create these randomized blobs around them. Depending on the brush shape, its size and the noise pattern, we can end up with very different results. Then we can use an offset mask with another block so we can quickly create these randomized diagonal lines underneath the canopy to create a sense of movement for the tree. Then of course we actually need to paint the leaves, where I recommend using a mix of leaves, glass and air to break down some of the patterns. So you can see how using the different methods for the leaves we can end up with very different tree styles. When it comes to building structures, there are roughly two scales that we can work with. When we are working on a small scale build, the most useful tools are the ones from here, which will allow us to move, stack, rotate, flip and copy segments of the build around until we get the shape that we want for our structure. In particular, two good tips are the smear tool to facilitate the creation of roofs, walls and diagonal builds, and the Symmetry tool to replicate what we do on one side to the others, of course when we want the build to be symmetric. Then when it comes to larger scale builds, using these tools might not be the fastest. That's when we can use others from the editor menu, like the Shape tool for instance. With this we can grab cubes and cylinders to design the layout of our build. The most classic example is the making of a castle, where we can use a cube for the main structure, cylinders for the towers on the sides, and a cone at the top of each tower for the roofs. Something worth mentioning is that in this menu we can go to File, Open Reference Image to load into the game a picture of any build or place in real life that we can use as inspiration or reference for what we are creating. After we get the general layout of our structure with the Shape tool, we can go back and by hand begin carving out windows, doors and add all the smaller details to our castle. A couple useful tools here are the Magic Select, where we can turn off the different options to select only horizontal or vertical lines. That way we can easily carve them out and create more interesting patterns on large builds. Then the Modify tool in Rotate Copies mode can be also useful for the roofs of the towers. If we don't like the cone, we can get rid of it and make a more fancy shape with a curve going up from one side to the center. And then use the Modify as we saw before to rotate it all around and get the frame for this fancier roof in place. Then we can very easily fill it in by using the Symmetry tool. This is great for basic structure shapes and orientations, but let me show you something that we can use when the things we need to do are a bit more complicated. For instance, let's say we have our main castle and 4 different towers in different places, and we want to connect them with the castle wall. But if you see, they are not perfectly aligned, so we can't do a straight line or a diagonal one. What we need is a curved wall, or something more irregular. Then what we can do is create a segment of the wall in a regular orientation. Let's do something simple like this for now. Then we need to copy this with Ctrl+C and head to the Path tool. Here under Shape we can choose the option Custom Clipboard. So now when we add points to our path, it will start using the wall we designed to create the path. That way, if we choose a curve like Catmull or Bezier, we can very easily build our curved wall. Bear in mind that this takes into consideration the original orientation of your wall. So if it's not working for you, try rotating the wall 90 degrees and copying it again. Or if we design a simple arch, we can also use this to create something similar to what we see on the reference, and end up with an arched staircase that curves down. When it comes to painting the structures, we can use the tools that we've seen before, but here I want to show you a few extra things that can be useful for this. First, let's say we need to decide which blocks to paint our build with. We may have a vague idea of the color we want, but don't know which blocks to use. Then we can use these tools that you can find when you open the Creative menu. One is the color picker and the other one is the gradient helper. The color picker will let you input any RGB and hex values of different colors or select them with this slider. And then to the left it will show you the 12 blocks that are closer to that color. You can see as we move this dot around, those blocks will change. And on top of that, you have these boxes over here that you can turn on and off to set limitations to the blocks that will appear there, like only solid blocks, transparents, and so on. Now let's say we want to paint with something cyan, so we choose a color similar to that and grab the blocks close to it. Then we can choose a grey color with the same hue and grab the blocks that it suggests to make a gradient. It's not going to be perfect, but it can work. However, the gradient helper is the tool to use when we want to create specifically a gradient. What we need to do here is to grab the two extremes of the gradient and place them there. That way it's going to create the gradient for us. Then we can click on this arrow to bring it to our hotbar automatically. If we want to have a gradient between three blocks, we can also do that by placing the third block in the middle. This is a great start for the gradients. You can always play around with them and change the parts you don't like, but it's of good help. But in reality, what makes this super practical are these two buttons over here. If we click the magenta terracotta, it will bring the gradient automatically into our Gradient Painter tool, the one we saw before. So then we can use it to very quickly paint the towers with the gradient in the direction that we prefer. Or, if we click the brush instead, it's going to bring the gradient into the regular Painter tool. And as you can see, it's set to a different mode than what we saw before. The mode we saw before was to paint with the active block, but there's also a gradient mode that works really well. So when doing gradients, you can use any of the tools you prefer to paint your builds. For instance, we can use the Gradient Painter for the towers and the other painter with a different gradient for the roofs. One more thing you can use here to paint is the Noise Painter. We saw this one before, but here there are a few settings that you can tweak to make your noise patterns work in more fancy ways. The first one are the octaves. If you increase them, you can see how the preview gets a bit more noisy, and that helps to create a more realistic effect when painting, that you can also accentuate by increasing the lacunarity as well. The other parameter here has to do with the scale. We saw that we could increase the scale of the pattern to fit our build dimension. Well, if you turn this option on, called anisotropic, that is going to allow changing the scale in the different dimensions. With this, we can set a very large scale in the vertical or the Y direction, and very small in the horizontals. Playing around with these parameters and the blocks of our pattern, we can get this dripping down texture on the walls. And of course, you can play around with the different noise patterns as well. That creates a nice weatherization effect on the walls, but we can also invert it and make the vertical smaller and the horizontal larger, to end up with a different type of pattern that looks more like brick textures. And that's all that I wanted to show you about structures. When it comes to terrain, you can end up with very different styles depending on the tools or methods you use. So let's go over 3 different types of terrain that you can do with Axiom. For the first type, we can use mostly the elevation tool with the different raise and flatten modes and making use of the Heightmaps as we saw before. We can then smooth and elevate again and repeat until we get a shape that we want. We can reduce the brush size to create smaller details for our mountings, and once we get something we are somewhat happy with, we can do this trick where we increase the brush size to cover the entire thing and elevate everything together. That tends to give a really nice result. Using the Weld tool with a small radius to go around and simulate erosion is great to add that extra touch of realism. You can add erosion where you feel like it needs it, or follow the paths that were naturally created by using the elevation tool. Finally, adding rocks with a rock tool and a placeholder block can be great to add that extra touch. I will use the cuboid shape for instance to create some quick ones all around. Or if you have them, you can use more fancy rock presets, load them in and paste them around your terrain. Before seeing how to paint these, let me show you other ways of making terrain. The next type consists of using the shape tool to create the layout of the terrain. We can grab a cuboid shape for instance, separate the axis and adjust the scale to begin creating different chunks of the terrain in different orientations. Another shape that works really well for this is the cylinder, and you basically do the same to create the base for your terrain. After setting the layout, you can go back to it and break down the cylindrical shapes with the Weld tool. If you don't want to affect anything else, you can use a tool mask or select the terrain first with the Magic Select. If you want to hide the selection so you can see better, you can go up here to View, Show Selection. That way the selection will remain, but it won't bother you visually to do the melting. On top of that, you can use the Weld tool to smooth the transitions between the different cylinders and between the cylinders and the ground, to break down those 90° angles that they form. The Slope tool here is great to create a path going up and all around, and in this case again, the Weld tool can be used to create erosion, or the Rock tool to add rocks all around. You can see how the results from one and the other are completely different. The last way of shaping terrain that I want to show you is using the Lasso Select. We can go over here and set the depth of the Lasso Select to negative values. So now when we draw our selection and press enter, we can see that it will create this sharp and angled selection, that then we can fill in by simply dragging a block inside to end up with a very interesting shape for a cliff. This method consists of that, playing with a different depth and with your position relative to the surface you are looking at. If you are looking from a side, the selection will have a smooth slope, while if we look straight down, the selection will be more vertical. Then we can use this many times with different sizes and orientations to quickly create an interesting layout for our base terrain. Once we fill it in, we can use the other tools like Weld to smooth the transitions or Melt to create erosion. But we can also use the Lasso Select again, but this time with positive values of depth, to carve out sections. Basically, we align ourselves with the terrain and draw a selection. Then we press delete and that section of the terrain will be gone, leaving us with a really sharp slope. As you can see, the Lasso Select is a great and quick tool to create these sharp and angled cliffs. One more thing here is that we can also select the entire thing and use the Modify tool with a twist option and play around with the angles to quickly give our terrain a more interesting orientation. I've shown you all these methods separately, but you can mix and match the different styles together to end up with something more unique. And of course, these are not the only methods, you can explore the other tools to find the one that best fits your vision and style. Now when it comes to painting the terrain, I've already shown you before the angle tool mask to separate the flat surfaces from the vertical ones. And that's honestly one of the best ways of going about it. So we can do that first with some placeholder blocks like red wool for the vertical cliff faces and lime for the more horizontal ones. And if we need to, we can go back and use the Painter tool to modify those areas where the angle mask didn't reach, or where we want to add our personal touch. For instance, in the eroded paths we created, we can paint with more red wool, which symbolizes a stone. Now to quickly paint the red wool, we can use a very interesting and useful function called Autoshade. This is found at the top under the Operations tab. The Autoshade operations, as its name says, will automatically shade our build. Of course, we need to configure some parameters. We first need to select what we want to shade, in our case, the red wool. Now on the Autoshade menu, we can see that at the top it says Player Position. This means that our player is playing the role of the sun, meaning the surface that we are facing is the one that will be painted brighter, while the one that is facing away and we can't see will be painted darker. If we don't want that, we can change this to custom positions, allowing us to place multiple points of light, symbolized by this small yellow dot, where you can also customize their intensity. So for now, let's set a point here. Then we have ambient occlusion. I recommend keeping that on, the global illumination and the dithering, which in a way controls the noisiness. The more dithering, the more noise. I like to keep this one there or even a bit closer to 0. And at the bottom we have the palette options. This will help us decide which blocks to use for the shading. If we use automatic, the Autoshade operation will use the base block of our selection as the brightest, and it will consider all these conditions to decide which other blocks to use as the darker ones for the shadows. I recommend turning all these options on, and now let's change the red to something like light grey concrete powder. So that one will be our brightest block. And then we click Autoshade. We can see how very quickly this will shade our build, adding shadows and lights depending on the parameters we chose. If we don't like it, we can play around with the light positions and their intensities, with the dithering and so on. A recommendation here, sometimes this operation can use non-survival friendly blocks like bedrock or gilded blackstone. A quick way of fixing that is, while your selection is still active, we can press Ctrl R on our keyboard and that will open the Replace menu, where we can see a list of all the blocks that are inside the selection. So we can choose which one to change, for instance the bedrock, and then select what we want to change it to, for example to something of a similar color, like Cobble Deep Slate. If you want to have complete control on which blocks the Autoshade will use, you can change the automatic palette to a custom one, where you can choose which and how many blocks to use. For instance, something like this can give us a more fantasy-like result for the terrain. Then of course we would need to paint the lime wool with something that resembles grass or dirt or snow, depending on the style of terrain that you want. Now two more operations that are incredibly useful for terraforming. Let's say we have this terrain and we want to bring it over to survival. Right now as it is, it's filled with blocks inside, so we can select it all with a box selection and go to Operations Hollow. That way, now it's all empty inside and we can bring this to survival and rebuild it if we want to. For the next operation, in landscapes like this one, we can first use an angle tool mask to target flat areas. And let's use the Freehand Select to quickly select them. And maybe we can add a few more manually. Then we can go to Operations Smooth Snow. That is going to create these snow patches in the areas we selected, which looks really good. If we want, we can expand the selection by clicking here under Select, Expand, and then Smooth Snow again. Add more selection if you need and repeat until you get the result that you want. And that's everything that I got to share with you today about terraforming. And that's the end of this tutorial. I hope you found this video useful and learned something new. Axiom is a very large mod, and what we got to cover here is not everything, but with what we saw is more than enough to find your own building style. If you watched this far, consider subscribing and liking the video. Thank you so much for watching. This has been Calvin and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.